academic year.
Are there any special museums that you're going to visit or areas near Washington D.C. that like relating to your field?
Well, in a way, because what I'm the project that I'm working on now is dealing with sort of the Western reception and understanding of ancient Egypt. So it's very much about sort of early modern and 19th century history as much as it's really about ancient Egypt. There isn't a ton of ancient Egyptian things here. There are some at the Museum of Natural History, but in terms of books and discussions about these issues from the early modern period and from the 19th century, there's a lot. So I'm really quite well stocked here.
Yeah, I was just researching before the call the whole Rosetta Stone issue in France and England, and so we'll talk about that. But let's jump into it. I'd love to just start by asking you a pretty easy question to answer, and just like, how did you what age and like what prompted you to get into Egyptology, and when was that kind of moment in your life where like you decided this is what you want to work on for the rest of your life?
It was really a matter of, because I was educated at the University of Copenhagen, and like many other places in Europe, you choose your level of specialization quite early on. In fact, by the time you apply to the equivalent of college here. So unlike the American sort of liberal arts tradition, where you get to sample different things, and you may not pick a major until even a couple of years into your undergraduate degree, you actually do that very early on in many places in Europe, and certainly at the University of Copenhagen, where I studied. So I made that choice when applying to university in the first place, and it came out of a fascination, especially with ancient thought and ancient languages. Especially, I had studied Latin and Biblical Hebrew sort of on my own, and I was fascinated by the idea of being able to read what people were thinking, thousands of years ago, but also sort of accessing the thought structures in terms of what language they were speaking and thinking in, what vocabulary they had available, and that sort of thing. And being interested in ancient thought like that, not necessarily any specific culture, but I guess sort of an interest in, as I conceived of it at the time, sort of original human condition or something like that. At least things that were quite different from ways of thinking in the modern age. If you want to go back to early thought, you really can't go much further back than the Egyptians. So that and then the close entanglement between image and writing, sort of the hieroglyphic writing, and the way that images stood for words and for ideas to some extent, was fascinating. So it was a logical next step in a sense to dive into that. And then, of course, once you start studying Egyptology, it's depending on the tradition, but certainly where I studied, it was a lot about the language, but it also had components of a number of other aspects of the culture, of course. So it's sort of a general study of the ancient Egyptians.
And I'm assuming you dove deeply into demonic language. And for the listeners, that's not demonic, that's demonic with a T instead of an N. But yeah, that's the predecessor to hieroglyphs, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's the successor to hieroglyphs. So it's a handwritten script that was in use in the last centuries before the Common Era. So it's derived from hieroglyphs originally as a sort of cursive abbreviated form, where you're writing a letter or a document, you don't want to be drawing a detailed bird every time you need to write a particular letter, and so you kind of abbreviate it naturally. And demotic is that late stage of that sort of cursive writing that was used for for a number of purposes, really, but for handwriting primarily.
Okay, and those were we're very lucky that stelae exist, or stela exist, because if they were doing most of this writing on something that didn't stand the test of time, we wouldn't see that. And do you I'm sure you've seen many of stelae. Do you have a number in your head as how many kind of you've viewed one, or is there one that sticks out?
Well, I've definitely seen lots of stelae, because from quite early on they become a sort of gravestone, really, but also are also used for official communication of royal decrees and things like that. So anything essentially you want to stay and sort of stand the test of time, where you're not necessarily building an entire monument for communicating this idea, but you have a self-contained smaller monuments. So lots of people from the highest echelons and kings to much more humble monuments are all using this format of the stela.
And I'm not sure if it is a stela, but the Rosetta Stone, obviously, it is. Okay,
it is. Yeah,
classified as one. So obviously, that's one of the most important ones, and it's funny that we're having this call at this time, because as we talked about, like 200 years ago, almost on the dot in September, John Champollion,
yeah,
Champollion, deciphered after a lot of work. Of course, he didn't do it alone, but he was kind of the main guy, I think, right? He deciphered the hieroglyphs and gave your field what it needed to really understand a lot more than we could. So let's talk about that. How did that go about? I'm not sure if you know much about his history, but what was kind of that pivotal month or kind of year that he had to lead up to that?
Yeah, so it's people have been interested in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs for centuries, of course, and one of the main obstacles to figuring out how it worked was an idea stemming from Renaissance interpretations, according to which the hieroglyphic script was a sort of a pure script of ideas. So it accessed the realm of ideas directly, or concepts directly, without going through any human language. And that was really interesting to Renaissance scholars who were interested in Platonic ideas and this sort of notion of something behind human language. But in fact, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs are a script like numerous others. It was used to write a particular language, and so you needed that realization, and the realization that at least some of the signs were key to particular sounds, and those sounds made up a language that you needed to understand. So it wasn't that you could sort of just interpret the symbols directly, but you actually needed to understand the language and its sounds and its grammar. And the Rosetta Stone was useful for this because it had a royal inscription where you had the name Ptolemy written there. Now Ptolemy is a Greek name; it's not an Egyptian name. So you had to spell that out using the phonetic signs, which is not the way you would write an Egyptian royal name. It's a slightly different system, but the fact that it was written out phonetically and it also occurred in the Greek text, so it was the same inscription in hieroglyphs, in Demotic, and in Greek, meant that you could sort of see, because the Egyptians helpfully wrote royal names inside a so-called cartouche, and an oval shape that demarcated the royal name. So you knew which part, or at least you could hypothesize that was what was going on with that oval, and that hypothesis turned out to be correct. And knowing that oval was meant to say Ptolemy, you could sort of start to map those signs onto to the sounds that you find in the Greek. And this was done not by Champollion at first, but by the British scholar Thomas Young. But again, that was quite a special case, because it was a writing of a foreign name that you had to spell out phonetically. So you needed more hypotheses to understand what was going on in the indigenous Egyptian part of the script. And that's where Champollion, he was interested in all sorts of languages, and one of the languages that he had learnt was Coptic. Coptic it was and is the liturgic language of the Egyptian Christian Church. And it wasn't widely known whether that had any relationship to the hieroglyphs. We now know that it does. It is in fact the direct successor of the language that was written in the hieroglyphs, and that was what Champollion hypothesized. So he made that, or he followed up on that idea, which had been presented earlier, but. So what you could do with that idea is, if you could recognize some of the signs in the in hieroglyphic inscriptions, and you could connect them, you know what that thing would be called in Coptic. You could hypothesize, well, maybe that's the reading of that particular name. And so he did that, for instance, with the name Ramesses. So that doesn't occur on the Rosetta Stone, but it occurred in a number of other places on monuments that were known at the time. And that has a son as part of the name, and he knew from Coptic that son was called Re, so he hypothesized that would be the first syllable of the name Ramesses. So once you begin sort of filling in those blanks, and you can set up hypotheses and you can test them against other monuments, and that was what he was doing, and he ended up explaining really most of the basic details of the script correctly, namely that it consists of some signs with phonetic value, some signs that stand for words, and some signs that stand for entire categories, the so-called determinatives, that where you have a seated man, for instance, that you put after all names or designations of human beings, or men in particular, and so on.
Okay, so his edge was Coptic. He was an expert, or close to an expert in that, and that really influenced. I'm sure someone else and maybe was going to be in Coptic in the future, but I'm not saying he did it and he's the only one who could have done it, but that gave him an edge, and then kind of push things forward, which is awesome. And then you mentioned sun, and I know they have the ancient. I'm not sure if it was pre-dynastic or Middle Kingdom, or when this really was a focus, but I know the stars and the sun and Ma'at and all that stuff, that's very influential, and they kind of look to the stars and the sun. How important was that in culture and Egyptian religion?
Oh, immensely important. The sun was really in most periods the central deity. It was worshipped in different forms and could take on different manifestations. But since quite early on in Egyptian history, the king was regarded as the son of the sun. So he was sort of the
I see. Okay.
The earthly representative of the sun god, and that's where he got his legitimacy, and that's what sort of set him apart from all other human beings. And similarly with the stars, the Egyptians were keen observers of the celestial cycles, and for instance, the star Sotis. The first time that appears in the year after having been absent for about 70 days, the so-called heliacal rising of Sotis, happened to coincide with the time when the inundation began, the inundation of the River Nile, which happened every summer and was of crucial importance to Egyptian agriculture. So that marked a sort of new beginning, and you could see that sort of mirroring of things that were happening in the sky and things that were happening on Earth, which is very central to Egyptian thinking, that you could use one set of observations to draw inferences about something else, because the universe consisted of these hidden analogies that you could bring out.
Okay, and then we'll definitely get back to the Rosetta Stone in a second. I just have a big question. Like you mentioned, so each pharaoh, even though back then it wasn't called pharaoh, they weren't called pharaohs, so I'll just king, I guess. They were the son of the sun god.
Yeah.
In the religion, was that, to the best of your knowledge, was this taken very, very seriously by every person, whether a peasant all the way up to the king, and it was widely believed in their hearts and minds, or was it a kind of almost ruse to did some people know that actually probably that's not real, and we need to hold our power with the peasants and then make it so we are living gods on this plane? What's your thought on that?
That's a difficult question, because as it happens, the vast majority of the sources, whether pictorial or written sources that we have pertaining to this ideology, comes from a very small elite group, from the kings themselves and from the very highest echelons of society, who had the means to construct lavish decorated tombs and so on. So that means that it's really quite difficult to get a sense of what the ordinary person on the street might have thought about these things, and probably it differed quite widely between different periods as well. But certainly what we can see is that those elite people certainly subscribe to this idea, but then they also had a clear interest in promulgating the ideas. So again, that makes it difficult to gauge how heartfelt it was, or whether they were sort of presenting these ideas out of convenience. But what we can see certainly is that they thought about these ideas and they elaborated them to a degree that would certainly not have been necessary to just to convince the unwashed masses of people that they should be the rulers. So they, at least some of them, and at least the people whose voices we tend to hear in the monuments, did seem to take this quite seriously and carry out the prescribed rituals and make the theological compositions to back this up to a level that, again, wouldn't really have been strictly necessary for if it were just for propaganda purposes.
That makes sense. One counterpoint, though, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there were, especially with, I'm not sure in Egypt if they were called concubines, but as with every ancient civilization, there were concubines. Some of those concubines or other conspirators actually have killed gods or kings and went against it. So that itself, of course, would show me that they weren't scared of what happens after that. So what were the moments of
yeah, definitely. It's clear that there was definitely also a practical sense of how you could manipulate these ideas for your own gain. So one of the key things is that, of course, it wasn't always. It was supposed to be the eldest son of the chief royal wife that succeeded to the throne. But the chief royal wife might not have any son, or that the son might die before he had a chance to become king, and so various things could happen in principle that meant that reality didn't live up to that neat model. But at least in some instances when that happened, the idea was then that the person who became king by the fact that that person had become king showed that that person had been engendered by Amun-Ra all along, because otherwise they wouldn't have become king. So that's a kind of projection back of the ideas that allows you to work with these ideas. But you're also right that there was the so-called Harem Conspiracy, where people tried to get someone else on the throne rather than the person who was supposed to follow the reigning king and that sort of thing. So yes, it certainly wasn't something that people were completely duped by, or that couldn't be negotiated or contradicted. Although again, even in that case, it's not just any person that was going to get on the throne. It was someone for whom you could, in principle, make some kind of argument of a lineage, and that would have bolstered the chances had this attempt been successful.
And the Harem Conspiracy with if I'm not mistaken, Akhenaten?
No, that's Ramses III.
Okay, all right. Got it. Yeah, you make a good point that there's really no way for us to know, because the people who are writing things down that we read today would write the same thing either way. They would not be writing.
Exactly.
So that's a good point. Back to Rosetta Stone. What year again? Just so not what year, but yeah, what year was the Rosetta Stone roughly carved out? And then can you also explain the reasoning behind the Greek and the hieroglyphs? And I think there was a third section as well. And then of course there are sections that you can explain that unfortunately we don't have, which really is not great. But yeah, the top and the bottom are gone, I believe.
Yes, but a significant part of the hieroglyphic inscription is gone. So yes, this was made in the Ptolemaic period, which is the period after the conquest of Alexander the Great, right. And he conquered all of the known world in principle, and it was his world, his realm was divided after his death, and Egypt was not exactly given, but the successful contestant over Egypt was Alexander's general Ptolemy, who then became the founder of a dynasty of kings. And this is the period when the Rosetta Stone was made. So it's a period where Egypt is under Greek, Macedonian rule, and this is why we get that bilingual, really trilingual inscription, where on the one hand we have the hieroglyphs, which are sort of the really ancient traditional way of making an official statement, the sacred writing used in temples and so on. You get the demotic text, which is the text that was used more for everyday purposes, for administrative purposes, and as we talked about, was really from the outset understood as handwriting. It has all these curves and curls that are easy to write when you're writing with a reed pen, but are actually not all that well suited for writing on stone, although it was used on a number of stone monuments as well. And then you have the Greek text, that would be the text or the text that was in the language of the ruling class during this period. So the idea was that it could be understood by everyone in what was essentially a bilingual society, because you had the upper echelons of the society. It was ruled by Greeks, or at least Greek-speaking people, and then you had various indigenous traditions, notably the priesthood, who were using Egyptian language, and this is precisely a royal decree dealing with the organization of various internal temple matters, and so it made sense that it was written in those three languages to be able to address different groups in society, and also to display the king as someone who wanted to and could speak to all of the members of his society. In principle.
His all subjects. Okay, and I see a huge irony here, which is, of course, it's not the best for the Egyptian people and the Egyptian state to be conquered, but if it was not conquered, we might not know how to decipher hieroglyphs, because without that Greek, I don't think we would have. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, I think that's right, because you needed that sense of what the text was about, and that's one of the things that was made things really difficult until the Rosetta Stone was found, that even if you had the idea that those were royal names, you wouldn't know what royal names they were, so you didn't have anything to test it against, and that was sort of the key that allowed that decipherment. So yes, if I mean, I suppose there might have been other reasons to make bilingual or even trilingual inscriptions or documents than just that particular situation, but definitely that that political reality of having Greek-speaking rulers and obviously Egyptian-speaking subjects was what motivated the creation of this monument, and as you say, that was really crucial in figuring out how the script worked.
Yeah, and then so now he deciphered it. What happens in the month and maybe a couple of years after that? I'm sure it's a frenzy to just start gathering all the knowledge now that we can gather knowledge.
Yeah, there's been a frenzy for some time in terms of it was realized that once you had that the same text in different languages, you would be able to make at least some headway with the decipherment. But yes, of course, it then becomes imperative to get as much material together to be able to make new readings, new decipherments, and Champollion himself travels to Egypt in order to amass more inscriptions, and he wrote letters from there that were published and become very influential. Quite tragically, though, Champollion died quite young, and his knowledge of hieroglyphs was really unrivaled. And what that meant, or at least what that contributed to, was that whereas we tend to think of 1822 as sort of flicking a switch, and now everybody could just read Champollion's works, and they would be able to read hieroglyphs themselves. But in fact, there was a lot of work that had happened to go into going from that sort of figuring out how the script works to actually being able to translate all the words and figure out how they fit together, and that sort of thing. So the first full translation of an inscription doesn't actually occur or get published until 3 decades later, so we're into the 1850s, and this sort of situation where people would be able to consult a number of translated inscriptions to be able to get a sense of what were the Egyptians actually writing about. Again, that takes a couple of further decades, so that's a long hiatus there in most of the 19th century, really, where people were certainly able to build on Champollion's insights, but the situation that we immediately imagine, namely that now everyone could sit down and read an Egyptian inscription, that doesn't happen until the late 19th century. So that's worth bearing in mind, that it was a huge achievement, but it wasn't something that changed the world overnight.
Okay, that helps me, because I thought it was a switch, like you mentioned,
Right.
and everyone was ready to go, and there was a lot of discoveries after that. Is there a point in time between then and 2022 right now where there was just a mad dash and discovery was crazy, whether it be stele, whether it be decipherments, whether it be archaeological discoveries? I'm thinking that's in the early 1900s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and so the late 19th century and early 20th century was when people really started doing archaeology in a more or less modern sense, and sort of systematic, not always well recorded, but that was a frenzy of activity, certainly. And it's worth mentioning that follows quite directly from the British occupation of Egypt in 1882, where Egypt does not formally become part of the British Empire, but it's the Veiled Protectorate, as it's known, and it's basically a British occupation, and so we get that the colonial interest in Egypt goes back, and in fact the reason the Rosetta Stone was found was that Egypt was invaded by Napoleon's armies, so that there is that recurring colonial background to many of the turning points in the history of Egyptology. That's worth bearing in mind, and certainly we can see that quite directly, that access to Egypt under British occupation led to or at least contributed to that enormous increase in archaeological activity.
And when was most of the work in the Valley of the Kings done, like with Giza? Was that same time frame?
So there's a two different places. Giza is outside of Cairo, so in the north of the country, and the Valley of the Kings is in Luxor, in the southern part of the country. The Valley of the Kings, and really the pyramids at Giza as well, have been of interest for a long time. And some of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings were explored early in the 19th century, and yes, even earlier than that as well, of course. Yeah. And the pyramids have been topic of discussions ever since the ancient Greeks, certainly in medieval and Renaissance periods, and going forward as well. So a lot of interest had been invested into these places, and they were, especially Giza, which happened to be conveniently located near Cairo. If you were going to on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, that was kind of a part of the standard tour you would be going on, whereas Luxor, being in the southern part of the country, was a little bit more out of the way, but it was widely considered worth it to make that detour down there as well. Again, the more systematic work in both of those places really began in that period that we've just been discussing. So the late 19th and early 20th century.
And was his grave, did it have most of the stuff in it? Were the grave robbers of history able to get in there, or when we made the big kind of excavations, was there still enough for us to kind of look into? It varies a bit. There were some spectacular finds of more or less undisturbed tombs. Again, part of the problem with many of these the excavations at this time was that they were not
really recorded in a way that we are now able to reconstruct where the different things were found in what context and so on. It was more about finding treasures to send back to the museums and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, many of the records from that period are quite sketchy. Some tombs were found intact. And so speaking of anniversaries, this is also the centenary of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, which was a royal tomb that was found virtually intact. That's pretty much a unique occurrence, but that happened, and then that happened to be documented in great detail in ways that really shaped our understanding and made Tutankhamun the kind of pop cultural phenomenon that he is today.
Okay, and then was his grave? I don't know what pyramids are associated with which pharaohs. Was he one of the large pyramids in Giza?
No. He's buried in the Valley of the Kings.
Okay.
In fact, in quite an unassuming tomb that may originally have been intended not for a king but for a private person.
Okay.
He died quite young and wouldn't have had time for building the kind of very deep rock-cut tombs that one would have expected of a king at this time.
Yeah, because Khufu started his building way before he died, obviously. I'm assuming.
Yes, and so that was a pyramid, and in the New Kingdom, you had these rock-cut tombs that were hidden away in the Valley of the Kings, but nonetheless, some of them are extremely deep and would have taken decades to build as well, same as the big pyramids.
So we talked about this a little bit when we first chatted, but the big thing that I have, obviously everything makes sense in terms of the stones and what they're composed of, and but what is the general understanding of? They obviously had amazing knowledge of physics, clearly, and then an amazing knowledge in just geology and understanding stone work, of course. But what is the accepted way that possibly these people got these stones so high, which is the only thing, again, that I see crazy about the pyramids even today? Engineers say, wow, that's awesome. So yeah,
that's a good question, and one that people haven't agreed on.
right.
I think it seems obvious that they must have used some sort of ramps to be able to do this.
Yeah.
But there are several competing theories about how those ramps might have looked, where they would be located. It's even been suggested that they might have been inside the pyramid itself, and it's difficult given that there aren't signs of these ramps. So it really becomes quite theoretical and sort of a matter of calculating how steep would they be, how long would they be, that sort of thing. I think the key point, though, is that there are several possibilities that seem quite reasonable. So we may not be able to pin down exactly how those stones were lifted to that height, but it's not sort of beyond the pale, considering the kind of technology they had available and what we can see, what they were doing elsewhere. And that's one of another important point, I think, is that The Great Pyramids of Giza are obviously very impressive, and it boggles the mind how they were built. But they're part of a historical trajectory with a long period of experimentation at a smaller scale, and so the first pyramid, the so-called step pyramid, is about a century before Khufu. So there's been a lot of time to perfect that, and in fact there are numerous pyramids in between those, and we can see how the step pyramid is not a true pyramid with smooth sides, but it's made as the name implies in steps, starting off as a traditional so-called mastaba tomb, a rectangular tomb, and then someone had the idea of expanding by building several of those shapes on top of each other, so you get that step-shaped pyramid. So you can see the idea developing, and then in the following decades, you can see how different kings experiment with these ideas. So it's the pyramids at Giza are the apex of that development, and it continues afterwards as well. And it has in the late 5th and 6th dynasties, kings began to have their burial chambers inscribed with religious text, giving us a sense of what this was all about, what were the sort of underlying concepts. So we understand this quite well, and as you say, we understand increasingly well the logistics of ferrying the stones over. At the time, you would be able to sail right up to the construction site, more or less, whereas now the pyramids are located on the outskirts of Cairo, and with desert on the other side, but they were actually connected to the Nile, so you would be able to sail from the quarries. Well, the main quarry was actually located right next to the pyramids on the Giza plateau, and then the stones that you needed to get from elsewhere, you could ferry over. And there was even a recent recently unearthed a log book of one of the overseers of the responsible for ferrying those stones from the fine limestone quarries at Tura to the Khufu construction site, and they were sailing back and forth, and that's recorded in the so-called logbook of Merer. So we have that sense of the logistics that go into this. Unfortunately, he doesn't say how people would then actually build the pyramid afterwards, because he was responsible for transporting the stones. But nonetheless, we see these little pieces of the puzzle.
So how far away was that quarry?
So that's not very far away, because that's the Tura quarry. It's about 10 kilometers from Giza, and it is sort of very, very high quality fine white stone, whereas the limestone available at the Giza plateau is quite coarse and was used for the bulk of the pyramids, and then the fine Tura limestone was used for the casing. That's now mostly gone for the same reason, that it's priced.
But after its construction, it would have been an amazing site, because it was completely smooth on each side, right?
And bright white, as opposed to the sort of sandy color that it has now.
And the tip of it, was that gold capped?
That's the idea.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the predecessors, it's cool seeing them try again, especially with the one where they actually had an angle like this, and then they changed the angle halfway up. I'm not sure what that one's called, but that kind of
the bent pyramid, where it seems that they realized that this is simply too steep, so they had to change the angle for construction reasons. So that's the hypothesis anyway, that it wasn't part of the original design. And if that's true, then that's a key moment where we can really see them sort of experimenting with what can be done in practice in terms of the engineering and the calculations and the logistics involved.
Do we know why they chose initially this pyramid shape, or did they just want to stack rocks as high as they possibly could, and that's the best physics way to do that?
I think that's probably part of it. But if we look at, and that sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier as well, if we look at those texts that people began to inscribe in the later Old Kingdom pyramids, we can see a set of religious concepts that are deeply occupied with the sky and celestial cycles, and we get the idea expressed there that the deceased king is to rise to the sky and join the circumpolar stars, so the stars that are visible all year round, as a kind of pivot around which the entire cosmos circulates. So if that idea was prevalent in earlier times as well, which seems like a reasonable supposition, then one point of that shape is that it's a connecting point between heaven and earth as a way of sending the deceased king back to join the ancestors in the sky.
Gotcha. And your expertise is around funerary culture. And what kind of items were these pharaohs, kings buried with?
I wish we knew, because from this period we just that there are no undisturbed burials of kings. So what's left in the pyramids is the stone sarcophagus, and that's that's it. So it's difficult to say. There's certainly space for some sort of burial goods, but the slightly disappointing answer is that we just don't know.
Okay, gotcha. And would the king's harem and maybe family go with him to the grave, such as they did in for instance, the first emperor of China, of course, with the famous terracotta warriors? Was it similar to that?
No, not in the Old Kingdom. For earlier periods, that there are some examples of retainer graves that are somewhat similar to the kind of thing we see in China, but for the Old Kingdom, no.
Gotcha. And how did you get into funerary culture of Egypt? Like, when did you navigate and said, this is the interest, this is interesting, this is what I want to go into?
I think I started getting, well, it really probably was one of the things I was interested in when I just started out.
Right away. Okay.
Because the funerary texts are so unique to Egypt, and they're so rich as well. If you just open a translation of, say, the Book of the Dead, there are lots of weird things going on. It feels quite impenetrable, and in some ways it still is. But it's a fascinating. It's a fascinating corpus of text that we don't really find in anything similar to in other places in the world, and again it has this rich conceptual world where you can see the kind of things they were thinking about. They also raise lots of questions about how to actually understand them. What is it that they are about, and why did the Egyptians want to write these texts in the tomb? But it started out as an early interest, and as one of the worlds that opened when I first learned to read hieroglyphs, and I ended up writing my dissertation about the so-called coffin text, which is the Middle Kingdom, so early second millennium BCE version of that tradition, or instantiation of that tradition of funerary texts.
So on the coffin, they would write a certain story or maybe command of some sort?
Well, they're ritual texts, which is part of what makes it difficult to, because they're sort of the recitations that you would use in some kind of ritual, but we don't have the ritual. Of course, we just have the text, so they're full of mythological allusions, and there are lots of strange things going on. So sort of the traditional explanation is, well, that's because they're a literal description of the afterlife. So you can expect weird things to be happening in the afterlife, and so probably that's what they are. Now we are gradually getting a better grasp of these texts, I think, and realizing that they actually come from quite a few different walks of life, and that they don't necessarily make a coherent narrative, but they're all there because in one way or another they pertains to the situation of the deceased in the coffin. So apart from the sort of rather impenetrable nature and obscure allusions and so on, they're also quite different. And one of the things we need to think about to understand them is what might this text originally have been used for prior to being inscribed on this coffin, which is how we happen to know of it at all.
And what did the Egyptians think of death? What did they think when someone died, when someone passed away? What was that person going to right after that in their mind?
Well, that depends a lot on who you ask, I think, because again, there's this tradition of understanding that we can just read what it says inside the coffin, so in the Book of the Dead, and then we'll see exactly what they thought would happen when they died. I personally like to come at it from a different angle and say, well, what we know from the way the living thought about the dead and their interactions with the ancestors is that the key point was to transform the person who had died from being an ordinary human being who now was no longer into an ancestor that you could relate to. So there was the idea that ancestors would watch out for their descendants, and that there was often really a kind of quid pro quo between the ancestors and the living descendants, and you kept the ancestor happy by carrying out the prescribed rituals and bringing offerings. You could expect in return that they would protect you from hauntings by other dead persons, or from illnesses. They would make sure that your family was fertile and able to procreate, and your household was thriving, and that sort of thing. So there's really that notion that the ancestors remain an integral part of society, and in order to establish that situation, you need to carry out rituals to make sure that you transform the deceased into an ancestor that you can start having those kinds of relationships to.
Interesting. So that kind of still points to this life on Earth being a singular existence, instead of maybe there being another existence and another one past this life. Based off of what you said, I guess that.
Yes, or at least that's where the emphasis seems to be.
Right.
So again, much of that question then comes down to whether that's just different perspectives. Is that just because we're then taking the perspective of the living versus that of the dead? But again, the reason that we have tended to understand the funerary text as a description of an afterlife is that we've sort of come to expect that that's what the Egyptians should be believing in. Well, they were clearly very interested in. They expended lavish amounts of time and energy on their tombs and the funerary preparations,
right.
And to Western scholars, that has immediately sort of evoked an idea that, well, they must be doing that to secure their status in the afterlife, and to make sure they have a pleasant afterlife, and that sort of thing. It's it's quite difficult to find text or imagery that are clearly and explicitly sort of confirming this idea. So it's part of that. I think the broad rethinking of what the funerary texts are is questioning this idea that they're necessarily literal descriptions about what the Egyptians thought would happen in the afterlife, and that's sort of the driving force behind everything that they were doing with their tombs.
Gotcha. But they clearly, obviously, felt something happens. There's some sort of existence, I guess, after death. And would they write actual steles, I believe, right, to their ancestors to ask for help in certain scenarios?
Yes, that's how we know about it. Of course, we assume that much of that would have happened through prayer and recitation and ritual as well. That sort of interaction with the deceased. But every now and then they did write down letters to the dead, as they come to be called in Egyptology, where they are addressing particular concerns they have, again, that's how we know about the kind of things you would expect from an ancestor, because those are the things that people actually ask them to do, or they complain about the ancestor not having fulfilled their side of the bargain, although the living emphasize that they have done everything they were expected to do. They made sure that the ancestor had a good burial, and they've made sure to uphold the rituals as prescribed, and they haven't messed up the recitations. This is sort of something that they claim in terms of these services for the deceased, and then so for that reason they now expect that the ancestor is doing their part.
So if you're asking for a child and you're for whatever reason biologically infertile, and you did everything by the book and still no child, you would just assume your ancestor left you in the dust?
Yes, that seems to be the case. It's one of the ideas that occur slightly less often, but we have a letter that talks about asks the ancestor to make sure that I get a healthy male child, and then at the end of the letter, interestingly, it also asks for a healthy male child for the daughter of the ancestor. So this is the son writing, and he also wishes for one for the daughter. So in that case, it's not accusatory in that sense. It doesn't seem to imply that the ancestor should already have made sure this happened, but it's part of a longer message where it says that this is a concern of mine that I would like you to address, because you are an able ancestor spirit. Is sort of what the reasoning that the writer gives. So the idea is that it's an ancestor spirit that is able to fulfill wishes or expectations among their descendants.
And was this practice done by all tiers of society, or just the royal side?
No, these are private people, perhaps not exactly from all walks of life, but there's nothing particular that says elite about these practices, apart of course from the fact that they would need to have access to a scribe who could write the letter if they weren't able to write themselves, and that's sometimes a little difficult to determine what how large a group in society would have had access to that. But it's certainly not a royal practice, or a practice that is limited to the very high elite.
So all ancestors have that obligation, is what I was asking. Okay, so that makes sense.
So the assumption is that what we are seeing with these letters is sort of the tip of the iceberg that shows a few cases where one, things were not working out properly, and two, for one reason or another, it was decided to address this issue in writing rather than in other ways that one might presumably have addressed it.
Okay, gotcha. And did the Egyptians, particularly in the Middle Kingdom, I guess, did they pray to their ancestors mostly? Did they pray to the current king or the Egyptian gods, or is it a big mix?
Well, there's a change over time in very general terms from a main focus, as far as we can see, on the ancestors as the go-to forces that you would address during the Old and Middle Kingdom, and then an increasing emphasis on private people addressing their concerns, leaving votive offerings and so on in temples to the gods later on. So that seems to be the general trajectory. Although there are the remains of temples from the Old and Middle Kingdom are much less well preserved than remains of temples from the New Kingdom. So our sources may be slightly skewed there, but certainly it does seem to be the general idea that for concerns where you needed the help of higher powers, you would go to the ancestors rather than the gods in the early periods.
Sure. And then I'm just curious, the rough outline here. What separates old / I think it's also called the pre-dynastic Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom? Why is that distinction made?
Well, it's basically a political distinction, and it's good that you asked, because I tend to just take these divisions for granted. But it's basically the kingdoms are periods when Egypt is ruled by a single king, and they are separated by intermediate periods. The first, second, and third intermediate periods, where there is more than one person making a claim on kingship. So that's sort of the basic division. What that implies in terms of lived reality. So the older idea is that the intermediate periods would be periods of chaos and warfare and general instability, and of course the kings during the kingdoms were quite keen on projecting that image as well. I think they're sort of the saviors of from the kind of chaos that would arise if you don't have a single king. But it's not clear that's the case at all. Some of those intermediate periods were quite long, and that does seem to have been periods of peace and stability during them as well.
Interesting. And then, of course, we build up to the, I guess I can call it occupation by Greece, and then Rome. So can you kind of speak to that? Like, I guess, like, why Greece, why Rome? How did that even happen?
Right. Yes. Yeah. So again, we talked briefly about Alexander the Great, who conquered an incredible mass of land and defeated more or less all of the traditional rulers in the area, and connected this into a single but very short-lived empire. As it happens, it was, as we also talked about, it was split up after his death, and then we get these individual kingdoms. And for the as far as Egypt is concerned, we then get a situation, as we talked about, with an elite of Greek speakers that are ruling over Egypt, and that sort of faces them with the question of how to deal with that situation, and what the Ptolemies, as this new dynasty is called, decided to do is to really adopt much of the imagery and the pageantry surrounding the traditional Egyptian pharaoh. So they have themselves depicted in traditional Egyptian temples, wearing traditional Egyptian dress, and doing carrying out the cult to the Egyptian gods. And so if you were just looking at these images, you would have no way of knowing that this was in fact not an Egyptian pharaoh, or rather it was an Egyptian pharaoh, but it was the Ptolemies.
So that's interesting. So they were completely Greek, but they tried to, I guess you're saying, convince the population that it was the God-given right for them to come and ascend the throne next, even though they're not Egyptian.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps convince the gods as well. So that's definitely that political dimension to it. But again, because they went so far, and they probably didn't necessarily have to support building new temples and supporting the priesthoods and so on. It certainly may have been politically expedient. In fact, the temples were probably a very good ally to have. But again, if we think of the mindset of the time, it's also quite likely that they had in mind that they had some very big shoes to fill here, and they needed to act accordingly.
Right, and I know there was the economy was uplifted with this kind of occupation of Greece, and those Greek leaders and aristocrats, I'm sure, came from Greece. But there was just a lot of dislike for the Ptolemaic reign by the Egyptians, correct?
Yeah, there was certainly a system where people were. It led to a separation in terms of language, even in terms of legal system. There were Greek laws and there were Egyptian laws, and so it. Again, the majority of the sources we have tend to come from the forces who were either quite happy with the rule, or had a clear and vested interest in seeming as if they were happy with the rule. So we never get quite the whole story in that sense, but just sort of extrapolating from what we can see about the sort of separation in society, it stands to reason that not everyone would have been happy with it. Some people would have gained from the occupation, and others would be significantly worse off.
And then, of course, we go into Roman rule. So can you speak about that and how that the catalyst of the Roman rule and any influence there by the Romans?
Yeah. So after a couple of centuries of rule by the Ptolemies, we then get a situation where there is civil war in Rome, and Egypt has this status as a fantastically fertile area that's providing much of the grain for the Mediterranean. So it becomes a really of real strategic importance in that connection, and there is in Egypt as well, that there is a disagreement over the rule between Cleopatra the seventh and her brother, and Cleopatra, as seen in many movies and Shakespeare play and so on, allies with first Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony, who was defeated by Octavian, the later Emperor Augustus. And when Augustus ends up being victorious in this civil war, Egypt gets annexed and becomes part of the Roman Empire.
And is it true that Cleopatra killed herself with a snake?
Well, many of these stories are the stuff of legend as much as of history, and unless we. Well, I'm not even sure how we would find out if that's true. Much of the time, you can sort of see who would have an interest in spreading these stories, and it sort of makes sense why they are popular in certain quarters and why it's a good story, basically. But whether it's true or not, that's probably something we'll never know.
Okay, we have Octavian, and then during Octavian's rule and after that, anything spectacular happened to Egypt, or did it kind of just live in relative prosperity with the Roman rule?
Well, it definitely had its ups and downs. One thing that's interesting in relation to what we've talked about with the Ptolemies is that Roman emperors also have themselves represented on temple walls and support building projects in one way or another in Egypt, which is even more surprising in a way, because some of them may not even have set foot in Egypt, and they certainly didn't have that sort of. Even if the society was divided, at least the Ptolemies were actually there. They were present and they were ruling Egypt, whereas of course the Roman emperors were ruling from Rome. So it's an interesting continuation of the idea that even though you're a Roman emperor and that Egypt is just a province in your realm, that age-old tradition of what it means to rule Egypt was still significant enough. And again, of course, there's a political expediency to this, especially if the Roman emperors were not a steady presence in Egypt, then they would certainly stand to gain from having themselves represented as pharaohs. But again, there may be more at work, as a sort of tradition of what it means to be a ruler of Egypt, and that you have a particular role that you need to fulfill to be able to do that.
Those Romans those are my ancestors. I wish we left Egypt alone. We should have just gave it back. And then, so obviously going from that now into the Victorian era and you mentioned to me there's a lot of influence of what we believe and think about Egypt because of this Victorian era. So I'd love to speak about that, of course, too.
Yes, and that also goes back to the point I was making, where not only is much of the excavation really taking off in the late Victorian era, but we also have that period between the decipherment of hieroglyphs and until text actually become readily available for scholars to work with in a concerted fashion, was about 50 years, really, half a century, where ideas were obviously developed. People were extremely interested in Egypt, both because of colonial interests in Egypt. That, as I said, in 1882, it ends up actually being occupied. But even before that, in the mid-century, there was a cotton boom, where the climate of Egypt is well suited for cotton production, and that happened to coincide with the American Civil War that ended up very much limiting the cotton production coming from there at a time when cotton production was extremely important in places like the United Kingdom. So you had a demand for cotton. So Egypt, once again, because of the fertile climate, became of interest. And it was interesting to think about Egypt, because increasingly people had access to human remains, mummified bodies from Egypt that were unrolled as sort of public spectacles in various places in Europe, to be able to find out questions about race, for instance, was on many people's mind at the time, and figuring out where did Egypt belong in new ideas of cultural evolution? Where did religious ideas come from? How did they spread throughout the world? All of these ideas were sort of really prevalent at the time. So people had lots of questions and came up with lots of answers, but those answers tended not to be based on the text. And that goes back to this question of the funerary text. That one of the main questions that people had, of course, was what did the Egyptians believe happened after death? What were the Egyptians' afterlife beliefs that seemingly had motivated them to invest so much time and energy into their funeral preparations? To answer that question, of course, it would be really convenient if the Egyptians happened to have left lots of texts and images that describe literally what they thought about the afterlife, and especially as that afterlife was increasingly coached in Christian-like terms. Those were the concepts that were available to scholars, so they began to think in terms of afterlife and eternity, eternal life, immortality, those kinds of ideas that are not necessarily easy to find in the Egyptian texts. But again, that wasn't the main concern. So by the mid-19th century, you're increasingly getting this idea that the Book of the Dead, that was the main instantiation of the tradition of funerary text that was known at the time. The Book of the Dead was a literal description of what happened when you died. So you could look at the Book of the Dead has images as well. So you could look at those images and you could see, okay, that lots of strange things happen there. And then increasingly, as you began to get translations of those texts, as I said, they're also quite weird. They are heavy with mythological allusions. They are completely taken out of their context. But again, if you come to those texts with an expectation that they're describing literally what happens in the afterlife, it doesn't really matter how strange or how ill they seem to fit together, how internally contradictory they seem to be, because that's just the way the afterlife might be for the Egyptians. And if there's no ancient Egyptian around to say, actually, this is not what we believe in, there's no internal grounds on saying about a text that this cannot be a description of the afterlife.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of it has been muddled down by just constant different cultures coming in, going out, coming in, going out. And that's very interesting. So now it brings us to modern day. Which is you. So what are you working on at the moment? What's on your mind? We'll talk about your book in a second from 2020. I'm happy to hear if you're writing a new one soon. But what's your mind share taking up right now?
Yeah, that's very much coming out of what we were just talking about. I'm working on a project right now that is tracing these ideas of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, looking at how people in Europe have been thinking about the ancient Egyptian mortuary religion. Why did they mummify bodies? What did they think about the soul? Those kinds of questions that have been on people's minds for a number of centuries by now. Again, there are lots of ideas feeding into this, starting from the Middle Ages, where mummies are used as medicine. So you were kind of people were impressed by the preservation of these ancient bodies, and the connection was made to particular substances of bitumen and asphalt and that sort of thing that was used for medicine. But it seemed to have preserved these bodies in a spectacular way, and so it was believed to have life-preserving capacities. So you kind of make the jump that this is why the Egyptians mummified people. It was to preserve their bodies for a long time and potentially for eternity, but again, that's not something that the Egyptian says. It's just an observation of the fact that these bodies were actually preserved. And so going from that, in the Renaissance, you begin getting access to and translations of classical authors that had visited Egypt or otherwise knew about Egypt, like Herodotus, Diodorus, and various other people who, in one way or another, wrote about the topic of the Egyptian mortuary religion. One of the sort of chestnuts that people would keep coming back to is that Herodotus has a passage in his history of Egypt where he describes that the Egyptians believed in a transmigration of souls, so a kind of reincarnation where when you died, your soul would go into an animal that was just being born at that time, and when that animal died, you would go into another animal, and you needed to go through every species of animal in that cycle over 3,000 years, and then you would return to a human body.
Very specific. What did he base that off of?
we have no idea. As with many things that Herodotus writes, it seems to be based on ideas that were current in Greece. So the teachings of Pythagoras. Later, Plato would have similar notions of a transmigration of souls. So he may have been talking about those ideas as much as about ancient Egypt, but he connected them to ancient Egypt. And for a very long time, really well into the 19th century, that was regarded as, at least by some people, as being a good explanation of why the Egyptians did what they did. But then, as we talked about, for a variety of reasons, gradually that framework was taken over by a more Christian-inspired framework, where it becomes about a transcendent afterlife. You go to heaven or you go somewhere else, and then you want to make sure that you have a good afterlife wherever you end up.
Because it sounds like it needs to be one or the other. If your ancestor is there to watch over you and then come down when you write to them, they're going to be there, or they're going to be a cat somewhere. Like it has to be one or the other, right? But no, it's interesting you say that, because I understand that monkeys were mummified, cats were mummified with their owners, I believe. Is that correct?
No, they're mostly sacred animals. So, so they were bred by the temples as a way of connecting to the gods that these animals were sacred to. So ibises to the god Thoth, and so on. So you would present these to the temple as a votive offering, as a way to connect with the god. But of course, people didn't know that at the time. So it could quite easily be connected with ideas about transmigration of souls, when you get into these huge burial vaults and you see thousands of ibises having been mummified, and you have this idea in the back of your mind of that Herodotus says that the soul goes into animals, and you can kind of connect the dots in a way that's completely off from a modern point of view.
It's also probably very hard to catch an ibis, so that's very impressive.
Right, they seem to have been bred by the temple, so that they would actually be able to, they had them for mummifying.
They're very beautiful birds as well. Is there a specific animal, maybe the hippopotamus or something that is just above all the animals in terms of is Anubis a cat or a fox?
It's a jackal. Well, that doesn't seem to have been that kind of hierarchy necessarily. Again, partly because many of the animals were connected to gods that had their individual places in the pantheon. The king was often connected to lions, as in the Sphinx, for instance, where the king had that sort of lion nature, or bulls. The king is often shown wearing a bull's tail. So there are particular animals that are sort of standing out in that sense, and that are connected to royalty for that reason. And it probably that probably gives an indication that they were regarded as having a special status.
There's a lot of mixing of animal parts with human parts,
right,
in bodies, which is very interesting.
Absolutely, that's very, very characteristic of Egyptian imaging traditions.
Yep. So your last work, Seeing Perfection. Let's talk a little bit about that. What kind of got you ready to write that, and what's it about, of course?
Yeah, so that's about Egyptian conceptions and experiences of images, where I'm kind of posing the question of how were images viewed? What was an image fundamentally for the ancient Egyptians? What relationship is there between an image and that which it depicts? The work on that came out of sort of a problem, a long-standing problem in Egyptology, or a challenge, we might say, namely that especially if we look at something like tomb statues, then or statues of the gods for that matter, Egyptians were in many ways acting with and on these statues as if they were alive. So they were a way of making the tomb owner present in his tomb. You would bring offerings there. As we talked about, you would write letters you could present in the tomb, and so on. So traditionally, we tend to say, well, the Egyptians made these statues, and then they would have experienced these statues in basically the same way that we would, but they then had a religious belief that the ancestor was present there, or they had a belief that the soul of the person depicted could inhabit the statue, or ideas like that. And that's a problem in terms of they very rarely, if ever, actually say that. So it's very much sort of an interpolation of an idea, but it's also it kind of privileges our own understanding of what an image is, because we assume that the Egyptians would have had the same idea, and then they just added some sort of belief or some sort of soul concept in order to bypass that. So we're assuming that they didn't actually experience it. We're assuming that it was sort of a mental projection, or an idea, a dogma, rather than something that they experienced. So what I try to do in Seeing Perfection is to say, well, what if we take what the Egyptians said and did with these statues at face value? What if we do not assume that we need some sort of soul to inhabit the statue, but that there just is an intrinsic connection between the image and that which it depicts? What kind of world would that mean the Egyptians lived in, and what implications would that have for practices like the making of statues, or the intentional destruction of statues, and other things that we see the Egyptians saying about statues and doing with statues. So that's sort of the point of departure of the books, sort of drawing the consequences of this different way of approaching the question, where we are privileging what seems to be the Egyptian experience, rather than privileging our own concepts, where we sort of know what an image really is.
Right, because it seems like it's a mix of art. It seems like it's a mix of a magical glyph that means something and represents something to come. It seems like just a mix of all that. So you're trying to nail that down.
Yes, that's right, and basically thinking about what could an image be to the ancient Egyptians. Of course, when you pose it at that level of abstraction, there's quite a few different things that the Egyptians could do with images, and it raises a number of questions, including sort of what is the role of likeness? To what extent does an image need to look like that which it depicts in order to function for whatever purpose it has? To the Egyptians, just looking at their statues, that doesn't seem to be hugely prevalent. They're not interested in making portraits that are true to every detail, sort of warts and all. They seem to be very idealized, and they seem to be very similar in a given time and place as well. So how does that square with the fact that one of the words that the Egyptians used to designate a statue was precisely a likeness? So that there seemed to be some idea that it's meant to be like the person depicted. And one of the things I then argue in the book is that if we look at how they use that concept of likeness in text, we can see that it's actually much broader, but also slightly different from what we might expect. It's not primarily a visual likeness, although that can be part of it, but it's a likeness to the deeper seated nature of the person depicted, or the category of the person. So we often have statues showing the tomb owner in a particular pose. He's either seated on a throne, or he's standing, or maybe he's sitting cross-legged as a scribe. But you have these very specific genres that you can slot into, and part of that, I think, has to do with that very different notion of likeness. That it's not a matter of individual visual likeness that needs to be reproduced, but you need a representation that is adequate to the nature of the person depicted on the one hand, and also to the situation, to the context in which that statue is going to be used. Because again, as I mentioned before, it's a way of making the tomb owner present. So he needs to be able to receive offerings. He needs to be waiting for people to engage with him when they visit the tomb. And so that's why we get these sort of quite a small repertoire of different types of statues.
I've always seen the Sphinx as a guardian of the tomb. Are you saying that it's more of a likeness of the king?
Yeah, it certainly is that, because it is the head of the king wearing the Nemes headdress typically. So it's an image of the king, but again, of course, it's not a capturing of what he actually looked like during life. That seems quite obvious in that case. But it captures his nature, right? Because he has some of that divine leonine nature by virtue of being king, which is why it's only kings that get represented as sphinxes, because there is that connection.
Got it. And I guess the bigger it is, the more people of Egypt under his reign can go visit him and give more offerings, and it's not a little room that he's in. It's, I guess, everybody can gaze upon him and wish and stuff. I guess, I don't know. That makes sense to me, at least.
Yeah, there are different contexts as well, where you set up images. Some are meant to be interacted with in a quite intimate setting, if it's an ancestor in a private tomb, for instance, whereas others are clearly sort of, as you say, really monumental display of the king's power, and where you deliberately get the sense that you are not engaging in a kind of quid pro quo, or as equals, or at least parties to the same bargain, but there's a vast asymmetry in the relationship, and you can express that by various means. You can express that by being represented as a lion, but also just by being represented in a colossal, larger than life size, in a conspicuous place.
Right. Were the god kings under the same ancestral obligations? Like, did they have to actually be there for their children who were then kings, or did they ascend with the gods in that kind of plane of existence separately?
That's a great question.
Okay.
It's difficult to say exactly what the role of the royal ancestors was vis-a-vis the private ancestors. So they certainly did have a cult, and one of the main things that you needed to have along with your tomb is a place where that cult could be carried out, the so-called mortuary temples of the kings. So that was definitely important, and we also have representations of kings bringing offerings to the whole lineage of previous kings which is really handy because that gives us a list of all the previous kings. So that's one reason why those kinds of representations have attracted a lot of interest. But to the Egyptians, it's probably not just about commemorating the past or remembering the different kings that came before, but it's very much a matter of worshipping them as part of the royal lineage or the royal ancestors. And again, most of these were not ancestors in a kind of blood kinship sense, but by virtue of being predecessors in the as kings, they become a kind of ancestors to the reigning king.
Were the kings, and how do I word this? Were they direct conduits to the gods in human form, or more relating to the gods, like as if a family member type thing?
Well, it's probably a distinction that can be difficult to draw exactly, but and it may also well have changed over time. They were a special kind of god. There was an expression that was used for the king, but only very exceptionally for gods, which translates roughly to the perfect god, or what it means is not that he was better than the others, so he was more perfect than the others, but perfect in this sense means to be present in a bodily shape. Incidentally, this is where I get the title "Seeing Perfection." The perfection of a god is its embodied presence in a statue. But the king didn't need a statue, at least from the outset, because he was present in an actual human body. Right. So you could translate it as the embodied god might bring us closer to how the king differed from the other gods that were present mainly in statues or through natural phenomena and so on.
Yeah, because it's just, for some reason, the thing that interests me the most about this culture is it seems to me one of the most drastic points away from each other of the farthest I can see that a king is farthest from its subjects. It seems like this is the farthest, like in no other civilization I can, maybe in Maya, maybe ancient, Japan with the emperor as well, seen as a god. But it seems to me like this is, at the end of the day, we know, of course, they're both humans, whether it's a subject or a king. But right. Yeah, then it just, I would love to see how that they interacted with them. If they really thought there were gods, I can only imagine if I knew a god was among me in my town or city, and I can only imagine seeing him walk down the street or something. It'd be amazing, right? So it's very interesting to me. So I ask all my historians this, so I'm going to ask you this as well, because and it's relative to your expertise. So pick a spot in the timeline of Egypt. But if you could be a fly on the wall in any moment in time, in any battle, in any discussion, or any maybe funerary kind of arrangement in the history of Egypt, what moment would you choose?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, there are quite a few potential candidates, as you can imagine.
Yep.
Well, I think for my own purposes, it would certainly be interesting to be part of a theological discussion among funerary priests of the Middle Kingdom, where they talk about what is really the meaning of all these things, and how to why are we putting these texts in the coffins and that kind of thing, because that relates directly to the kind of questions that I tend to ask. But I think probably on a larger scale, a pivotal moment like Akhenaten's reign, and getting a sense of what his his rationale was for his theological and political, social, administrative changes, I think would be extremely interesting to to witness.
I think you know what mine would be. Mine would be the I just want to see how they lifted those dang blocks. That's all I want to see.
Right.
And when can we hear from your current work? When's that? Are you going to publish a paper soon, or when's that coming up?
Well, I'm working on my book manuscript this year, and hopefully with any luck, it should be out sometime next year.
Perfect. Cool. We'll look forward to that, and maybe next year we'll have you back on. Rune, thanks so much for doing this. This was awesome. Very insightful. We had a big history lesson as well. There's too much to talk about, so maybe the next episode we can dial it into one specific thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big topic.
Yeah, perfect. I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much.